The Nestlé Corporation is the largest food and beverage company on Earth, synonymous with global brands, mass consumption, and unparalleled corporate power. Its empire was founded in 1866 by Henri Nestlé, who invented farine lactée, the world's first infant cereal, as a humanitarian miracle to save children who could not breastfeed, launching a global dynasty built on the promise of good food, good life. For over 150 years, the corporation has shaped global nutrition and consumer habits, controlling over 2,000 brands from Nescafé and Kit Kat to Perrier, operating in 186 countries and generating over $105 billion in annual revenue. Despite its humanitarian origins, the company's history is marked by dark and persistent controversies, including the infamous Nestlé Kills Babies boycott of the 1970s, persistent allegations of child slave labor in its cocoa supply chain, the privatization of public water sources, and the sale of tainted food to millions. Was Henri Nestlé a humanitarian or a reluctant capitalist? The founder, Henri Nestlé, was born Heinrich Nestlé in 1814 in Frankfurt, Germany, into a family of merchants and significantly glassmakers. He was the 11th of 14 children in a respectable middle-class family. He was a man of the industrial and scientific revolution. He trained as a pharmacist's assistant in Germany, a trade that, at the time, was a hybrid of chemistry, botany, and medicine. In 1833, as a young, ambitious man, he left Germany. The reasons, according to company history, were political. His family was reportedly involved in liberal revolutionary circles, and the conservative German political climate was becoming dangerous. He settled in the small, neutral, French-speaking Swiss town of Vevey on the shores of Lake Geneva. He changed his name to the French Henri Nestlé, and in 1843 set up his own small business. He was not at first a food producer. He was a classic 19th century chemist and tinkerer. Using his pharmaceutical knowledge, he produced and sold a variety of products: nut oils, liqueurs, vinegar, and even mineral water. He was a small-time local businessman, not an industrialist, but the world around him was gripped by a massive tragic crisis: infant mortality. In mid-19th century Europe, cities were exploding. Industrialization was drawing millions from the countryside into crowded, unsanitary urban slums. For new mothers in this environment, breastfeeding was often impossible. Many were malnourished themselves or were forced to work 14-hour days in factories, separated from their infants. The alternatives were grim. Wet nursing was expensive and unregulated. Animal milk was dangerous. It was often unpasteurized, contaminated with tuberculosis or other bacteria, and nutritionally indigestible for a newborn's delicate stomach. The result was a slaughter. In many European cities, the infant mortality rate was as high as 25%. 1 in 4 babies did not live to see their first birthday, with malnutrition and gastrointestinal diseases being the primary killers. Henri Nestlé, the chemist, saw this not just as a tragedy, but as a scientific problem to be solved. He began experimenting. His goal was to create a perfect infant food, a product that was stable, safe, and crucially, digestible. He used his knowledge of chemistry to break down the components. He started with good Swiss cow's milk. He added sugar for carbohydrates, and in a moment of genius, he added wheat flour that had been baked to remove the indigestible starch. This combination of milk, sugar, and processed flour was the first infant cereal, a product he called farine lactée Henri Nestlé. In 1867, he tested his new invention. According to company legend, his first customer was a premature infant who was near death, unable to tolerate his mother's milk or any other substitute. Nestlé's farine lactée saved the child's life. This story, which became the core of the company's founding myth, was a marketing masterpiece. Nestlé, the humanitarian scientist, had defeated infant mortality. He adopted his own family's coat of arms, a bird's nest, with a mother bird feeding her young, as his logo. It was the perfect symbol of safety, nourishment, and maternal care. The product was an immediate success. In 1868, he was selling 500 cans a year. Within a few years, he was selling 1 million cans a year across Europe. He had created an entire new industry, but Nestlé was competing with another giant. In 1866, the same year Nestlé was perfecting his formula, two American brothers, Charles and George Page, had also come to Switzerland. They founded the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company in Cham. Their product was different. Condensed milk, a thick, sweet, shelf-stable product aimed at adults. For the next decade, the two companies, Henri Nestlé's infant food and Anglo-Swiss's condensed milk, were fierce rivals. This early rivalry was according to some historical reports where the darker side of the Nestlé business culture first appeared. The company was accused of anti-competitive practices, of trying to steal formulas or poach clients from rivals like the German company Liebig. But these were, at the time, standard, rough-and-tumble business tactics. Henri Nestlé himself, however, was not a robber baron. He was an inventor who had become a reluctant industrialist. He was 60 years old, wealthy and tired of the stresses of a global business he had never intended to create. And, like his own father, he had no children to inherit the empire. In 1875, in a move that showed he was a scientist, not a dynast, he sold the entire company, his factory, his formula, and his name to a group of Swiss businessmen for 1 million francs. It was a massive fortune. Henri Nestlé retired to a quiet life of local philanthropy, funding a hospital in Vevey, and died in 1890, long before the company bearing his name would become a global controversy. The new owners, however, had no such reservations. They were not humanitarians, they were capitalists. They immediately began an aggressive global expansion, pushing the Nestlé-branded infant formula into new markets, including the colonial territories of Africa and Asia. This was the company's original sin. In the 1890s and early 1900s, Nestlé sales agents, often dressed as milk nurses, began to penetrate these developing regions. They marketed their scientific product to poor, often illiterate mothers as a modern, safer alternative to breast milk. This marketing, critics would later argue, laid the foundation for the humanitarian disaster that would explode in the 1970s. It was the first instance of the company allegedly prizing profit over the health of the most vulnerable infants, a charge that would come to define its legacy, from Nescafé to the Meiji Empire. In 1905, the great rivalry that had defined the Swiss milk industry ended. The Nestlé company, now run by professional managers like Louis Dapples, merged with its old competitor, the Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. This merger created a massive new entity, the Nestlé and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. This new combined firm was a global powerhouse with factories in the US, Britain, Germany, and Spain. The company's growth was supercharged by war. Just as Herbert Dow had profited from World War I, Nestlé's new combined entity became a primary supplier of processed milk and chocolate to the armies of Europe. This created a new controversy. Switzerland was famously neutral, but Nestlé was a multinational. It owned factories in both Germany and in Allied countries. Throughout World War I and later World War II, Nestlé operated with a pragmatic neutrality that critics saw as profiteering from both sides. They supplied condensed milk and their new milk chocolate to the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. At the same exact time, they were supplying their other factories to the British, French, and later, American armies. The U.S. government became a massive customer, ordering millions of cans of condensed milk and chocolate as field rations for its soldiers. Nestlé, as a neutral Swiss company, was playing both sides, raking in profits from the conflict. This reputation as a war profiteer was a charge that would stick, adding to the company's growing image as a corporation with no loyalty other than to its own bottom line. This era also saw the company's second great innovation, one that would become even more profitable than infant formula. In 1938, on the eve of another world war, a Nestlé scientist named Max Morgenthaler was tasked with solving a problem for the Brazilian government, which had a massive surplus of coffee beans. The result of his research was Nescafé. Nescafé was the world's first truly successful instant coffee. By freeze-drying the coffee, Nestlé had created a product that was lightweight, had an almost infinite shelf life, and required only hot water. It was another miracle product. And, once again, its first and most important customer was the military. The U.S. government, upon entering World War II, bought Nestlé's entire Nescafé production, including it in every soldier's sea rations. By the end of World War II, the company that Henri Nestlé had founded was unrecognizable. It was a global giant, its growth fueled by 2 world wars. It had a portfolio of iconic products, Farine Lactée, Nestlé's milk chocolate, and the new global phenomenon, Nescafé. In the post-war boom, the company, now led by a new generation of professional non-family managers, embarked on a massive campaign of acquisition. This was the strategy that would build the modern Nestlé. In 1947, they bought Maggi, the Swiss company famous for its instant soups and seasonings, giving them a foothold in the savory market. In 1950, they bought Cross and Blackwell, a venerable British food company. In 1929, they had already absorbed the great Swiss chocolate companies Peter, Kohler, and Kohler. The company was becoming an unstoppable conglomerate, diversifying out of its core milk business into every corner of the food industry. But the core of its business, the product that had started it all, infant formula, was about to become the source of the greatest scandal in its history, a scandal that would forever tarnish the Mother Bird logo and lead to the global, decades-long cry, "Nestlé kills babies," the deadly marketing campaign. The problem for Nestlé was that by the 1960s, the infant formula market in Europe and North America was saturated and worse, shrinking. In the developed world, a new post-war back-to-nature movement was emerging. Scientific and medical consensus was shifting decisively back to breastfeeding. Doctors and hospitals were encouraging mothers to reject the scientific bottle in favor of the natural breast. For Nestlé, this was a demographic and financial disaster. Their solution was to find a new market, a market that was not contaminated by this new medical advice. They targeted the developing nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This was a blue ocean opportunity. These regions had exploding post-colonial populations, high birth rates, and a deep-seated aspirational desire for modern Western products. Nestlé, along with other companies like the American Ross and Bristol Myers, launched one of the most aggressive and, as critics would soon prove, unethical marketing campaigns in corporate history. The strategy, documented by health organizations and later by the World Health Organization, was a systematic campaign to undermine the practice of breastfeeding and create an artificial dependency on Nestlé's formula. The first and most insidious tactic was the use of milk nurses. Nestlé would hire thousands of local women, dress them in white, nurse-like uniforms, and send them directly into the maternity wards of hospitals and clinics in Nigeria, Kenya, Brazil, and the Philippines. These milk nurses, who were in reality sales representatives on commission, would give advice to new mothers. They would tell them, with the full authority of a medical professional, that the modern way was better, that their breast milk was insufficient or low quality, and that a scientific product was the best way to ensure their baby's health. The second tactic was the distribution of free samples. These milk nurses would hand out free single-serving packets of Nestlé formula, often enough for the first few days of the baby's life. This was a diabolically effective hook. A new mother given these free samples would feed them to her baby. After a few days of not breastfeeding, her own milk supply would naturally begin to dry up. By the time the free samples ran out, her body could no longer produce milk. She was now physiologically dependent on the product. She had become a permanent paying customer, trapped. The third tactic was mass media advertising. Nestlé billboards and radio jingles blanketed these countries, all showing plump, healthy, smiling Nestlé babies, a stark aspirational contrast to the poverty and malnutrition that was rampant. They associated their product with Western modernity, health, and success. This three-pronged campaign was a massive commercial success. Nestlé's sales of infant formula in the developing world exploded, becoming a primary driver of the company's 1970s growth, accounting for a huge portion of its profits. But the human cost was a holocaust. The marketing campaign was built on two fatal, and in many cases deliberate, lies. The first lie was that formula was safer than breast milk. In reality, in the developing world, it was a death sentence. The second lie was that the mothers in these countries could use the product safely. The problem was water. Nestlé's formula was a powder. It had to be mixed with water. But the vast majority of Nestlé's new trapped customers lived in rural villages and urban slums that had no access to clean, potable water. They were mixing the expensive scientific formula with water from contaminated rivers, wells, and ditches, water often teeming with cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. The very product that was marketed as health was now the primary delivery mechanism for fatal waterborne diseases. The second problem was literacy. The instructions on the cans were often written in English, French, or German, languages the local mothers could not read. Even if they could read, the complex sterilization procedures, boiling the water, the bottles, and the nipples for 10 minutes were almost impossible to follow for a family living in a one-room hut with a single pot and a limited, expensive supply of firewood or charcoal. The third and most brutal problem was poverty. The formula was ruinously expensive. A single can could consume 20 to 30% of a family's entire weekly income. Mothers, desperate to feed their babies, but unable to afford the full amount, would try to stretch the product. They would over-dilute the formula, mixing 1 scoop of powder with twice or even 3 times the required amount of water. The result of this toxic combination, contaminated water and over-diluted formula, was a public health catastrophe known as the infant formula cycle. A baby fed over-diluted formula would be chronically undernourished. This marasmus, or severe malnutrition, would cause the child to become weak and emaciated. At the same time, the contaminated water used to mix the formula would give the baby severe, recurring gastroenteritis and diarrhea. The diarrhea would strip the child's body of what few nutrients it was receiving, accelerating the malnutrition. The mother, seeing her child sick and failing to thrive, would believe her own milk was the problem and would become even more dependent on the formula, further poisoning her child. This vicious cycle malnutrition leading to disease, disease leading to more malnutrition, had one common tragic end: infant death. In 1974, a British advocacy group called War on Want published a scathing 28-page report on this crisis. The report, written by investigative journalist Mike Mueller, had a simple explosive title: The Baby Killer. The report was a systematic indictment of the infant formula industry, and it singled out Nestlé as the largest, most aggressive, and most culpable offender. It detailed all the marketing tactics, the milk nurses, the free samples, the deceptive advertising. It laid the blame for the deaths of thousands of infants directly at the feet of the Swiss corporation. The Motherbird logo, the report argued, was a lie. The Baby Killer report was translated into German by a Swiss activist group. They added a new, even more inflammatory title: Nestlé tötet babies, Nestlé kills babies. Nestlé, the secretive, powerful Swiss giant, finally had a crisis it could not control. The company's response was not to change its marketing. Its response was to attack. In 1974, at their pristine Vevey headquarters, the managers of the Nestlé dynasty made a fatal calculation. They were the crown jewel of Switzerland, a global symbol of Swiss quality and neutrality. And now, a small group of university students and left-wing activists in Bern, calling themselves the Third World Working Group, had dared to translate the British Baby Killer report. Their new German title was blunt, brutal, and, in Nestlé's eyes, unforgivable: Nestlé tötet babies. Nestlé kills babies. The corporation, steeped in a culture of secrecy and invincibility, decided this insult could not stand. In an act of supreme corporate arrogance, they decided to make an example of these activists. They filed a massive libel lawsuit, not in some distant court, but on their home turf in Bern, Switzerland. It was the single greatest public relations blunder in the company's history. The activists, who had been handing out pamphlets in obscurity, were terrified, but their leaders understood what this meant. Nestlé had just fallen into their trap. The corporation, with its own money and power, was about to give them the biggest megaphone on earth. The trial, which began in 1975 and dragged on for 2 agonizing years, was not about libel. It became the Nuremberg trials for corporate ethics. The small Swiss courtroom was transformed. Nestlé's high-priced legal team, in their immaculate suits, was prepared to argue the technical, legal definition of the word kill. But the activists, led by their passionate, underfunded lawyers, didn't argue semantics. In many parts of the world, continue to this day. The Nestlé kills babies scandal never truly ended. It became a permanent toxic stain on the brand. It exposed the company's core, amoral philosophy that the emerging markets of the developing world were not populations to be served, but territories to be exploited, and that the lives of 1.5 million infants a year were an acceptable cost of doing business. This scandal, which defined the company for 3 decades, was only the first. It was the blueprint for a pattern of exploitation that would soon reemerge in 2 new, equally controversial areas: child slavery and water privatization. From child slaves to water vampires. The Nestlé kills babies scandal of the 1970s and 80s was a corporate catastrophe. It exposed on a global stage the fundamental business model of the Nestlé dynasty: target the world's most vulnerable populations, create a dependency, and extract the profit. The boycott and the subsequent WHO International Code was a massive blow, but it did not change this core philosophy. It merely forced it to metastasize. The immoral logic that had justified the milk nurse campaign in Africa was not an aberration. It was the blueprint. The company's professional managers, the heirs to Henri Nestlé's corporate throne had learned the wrong lesson. They had not learned to stop the exploitation, they had learned to hide it better. While the world was focused on the battle over infant formula, this same predatory business model was being perfected in two other, even larger, global markets: cocoa and water. This was the second and third act of the Nestlé tragedy. The company that had been accused of killing babies would now stand accused of enslaving children and stealing the world's water. The first of these scandals centered on the very products that define Nestlé's sweet image, its chocolate. Brands like Kit Kat, Keller, Crunch, and Nestlé Toll House are household names, synonymous with childhood and indulgence. But the primary ingredient for this multi-billion-dollar empire, cocoa, is sourced from one of the poorest and most exploitative places on earth. The global cocoa market is a duopoly. The vast majority, nearly 70%, of the world's cocoa is grown in two West African nations, Ivory Coast and Ghana. And Nestlé, along with its rivals Mars and Hershey, is one of the largest buyers in the world. Nestlé itself sources an estimated 30% of its entire global cocoa supply from this single volatile region. This entire supply chain, as investigative journalists and human rights organizations have documented for decades, is built on the backs of children. This is not a case of a few children helping on their family farms. This is a system of industrial scale, hazardous child labor. The definitive smoking gun is a 2020 report from the North Sea at the University of Chicago, an academic study funded by the U.S. Department of Labor. Its findings were not ambiguous. It found that 1.56 million children were actively engaged in hazardous labor in the cocoa fields of the Ivory Coast in Ghana. Hazardous labor is a clinical euphemism for a childhood spent in hell. It means children as young as 10 years old, and often younger, are forced to work 12-hour days for almost no pay. Their work involves using heavy razor-sharp machetes to hack the tough cocoa pods from the trees. They are forced to carry 100-pound sacks of beans, often for miles, through the dense jungle. They are the ones who spray the pods with toxic pesticides, often with no shoes, no gloves, and no protective equipment. Worse than this, as documented by journalists and activist groups, is the prevalence of child trafficking. Many of these 1.56 million children are not even with their families. They are in fact slaves. Traffickers lure or buy children from even poorer neighboring countries, like Burkina Faso, with false promises of money or education. These children are then sold to farm owners, where they are trapped for years, unpaid and physically beaten if they try to escape. This is the reality of the chocolate industry, and it is a reality that Nestlé has known about for decades. The scandal first broke in the late 1990s. The entire chocolate industry, including Nestlé, was put on notice. In 2001, they pledged to fix the problem. They signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement with the U.S. government, promising to eradicate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains by 2005. That deadline came and went. It was pushed to 2008, then to 2010, then to 2020. Now the goal has been pushed to 2025. Every deadline has been missed, and as the 2020 NORC report proved, the problem has not gotten better. It has, in many areas, gotten worse. The most significant battle over this was the U.S. federal lawsuit, Doe v. Nestlé. The case was first filed in 2005 by a group of 6 men from Mali who claimed they had been trafficked as children and forced to work as slaves on Ivory Coast cocoa farms that supplied Nestlé. Their lawsuit was not asking for charity, it was a landmark case, arguing that Nestlé was aiding and abetting slavery under the Alien Tort Statute, a U.S. law that allows foreign nationals to sue in U.S. courts for violations of international law. Nestlé's defense over the 16 years the case wound its way through the courts was not to claim that child slavery wasn't happening. It was to claim that they were not legally responsible for it. Their argument was a legal firewall. They claimed that as a Swiss corporation, they could not be sued in an American court for things that happened in Africa. Furthermore, they argued that they did not own the farms. They just bought cocoa from a vast, complex network of middlemen. They claimed they had no direct control over the farms and therefore could not be held liable for their labor practices. In June 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Nestlé. It was a devastating blow to human rights activists. But the ruling was not a moral vindication. It was a technical one. The court had not declared Nestlé innocent. It had simply declared that the case was filed in the wrong court, under the wrong law. But the evidence that emerged during the lawsuit painted a damning picture. The plaintiff's lawyers had argued that Nestlé knew what it was doing. They alleged that the company knew but did not act. They argued that Nestlé's entire business model relied on child labor to keep the price of cocoa low. They provided evidence that Nestlé had economic leverage over the farms and could have stopped the practice, but chose not to. This is the classic Nestlé playbook, perfected during the baby killer scandal. Faced with a human rights catastrophe, the company's response is a combination of legal obstruction and public relations. In response to the growing scandal, Nestlé launched the Nestlé Cocoa Plan in 2009. This was a massive, high-profile, 110 million Swiss franc program. It was on paper a perfect solution. The company's slogan was, "Better farming, better lives, better cocoa." The plan promised to train farmers in sustainable methods, improve community education, build schools, and monitor for child labor. But critics, including Fairtrade International and the World Bank, immediately pointed out the plan's fatal and perhaps deliberate flaw. It was a greenwashing campaign designed to treat the symptoms of child labor without ever addressing its disease, poverty. The World Bank estimates that 60% of the cocoa farming population in the Ivory Coast lives in extreme poverty on less than $2 a day. The reason for this poverty is simple: the price of cocoa. Nestlé, as one of the big three buyers, has effective cartel power over the global price. For decades, they have, critics allege, used this power to keep the price they pay to farmers artificially low. The farmers are trapped. The price they are paid for their crop is so low that they cannot afford to hire adult labor. They are left with only two choices: make their own children work or buy trafficked children. The Nestlé Cocoa Plan, in this light, is a cynical public relations shield. It allows Nestlé to publicly invest in building a few schools, while simultaneously continuing to profit from the very pricing model that creates the poverty that makes child labor inevitable. The 2020 NORC report, which found that 45% of child laborers in the region were still not attending school despite these efforts, confirmed the plan's failure. This predatory logic was not confined to cocoa. It was perhaps perfected in the company's exploitation of the single most essential resource for human life: water. Nestlé is the world's largest bottler of water, controlling a vast portfolio of brands from the luxury S. Pellegrino and Perrier to the mass-market Nestlé Pure Life. The Pure Life brand, in particular, is marketed most aggressively in developing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, using the exact same playbook as infant formula. Our product is modern, safe, and healthy. Your local public water is dirty and dangerous. The business model is simple and to its critics morally bankrupt. Nestlé does not make water, it extracts it. It finds communities with clean, abundant groundwater, buys a small plot of land, sinks a massive industrial well, and begins pumping out millions of gallons of public water, often for free or for a laughably small permit fee. It then puts this public water into a single-use plastic bottle, stamps its logo on it, and sells it back to the public at a markup of thousands of %. The scandal is not just the profit, it is the depletion. The pattern became infamous in the village of Pati Dilwan, Pakistan. In the 2000s, Nestlé built a Pure Life bottling plant there. For years, the company pumped millions of gallons from the local aquifer. As The Guardian reported, the results were catastrophic for the local community. The villagers' shallow wells, which they had used for drinking and farming for generations, ran dry. The water table dropped to dangerously low levels. The ultimate cruel irony was that the villagers, who once had free, clean water, were now forced to either drink contaminated surface water or, if they could afford it, buy bottled water from the very corporation that had taken theirs. This was not just a problem in the developing world. In the United States, Nestlé waged the same war on public resources. For decades, the company under its Arrowhead brand was pumping millions of gallons of water from the San Bernardino National Forest in California. The problem? They were doing it during the state's worst drought in recorded history. As the state imposed mandatory water rationing on its citizens, Nestlé's trucks were running 24/7, hauling 1 million gallons a day of public water out of the drought-stricken national forest. When investigative journalists began looking into this, they discovered the most arrogant detail of all. Nestlé's permit to pump this water had expired in 1988. For over 25 years, the company had been taking California's public water during a historic drought on a dead permit. The arrogance of this extraction reached its logical and most absurd peak in Vittel, France, the very town that was the source of its Vittel brand. Nestlé's pumping operations there were so vast that they were draining the local aquifer. As Le Monde reported in 2018, the water table was dropping by 30 centimeters every year. The local community was in a panic. The French government, in a move of stunning corporate capture, approved a plan not to stop Nestlé, but to build a massive pipeline to pump in water from another community to supply the citizens of Vivitel, whose own water was being bottled and sold back to them. This global business model, exploiting public water for private profit, was perfectly encapsulated by the company's own former CEO, Peter Brabeck-Letmathe. In a 2005 interview, Brabeck stated his extreme view on the issue. He declared that the idea of water as a public right was extreme, and that water was not a right, but a foodstuff that should have a market value. This single quote, which went viral globally, became the Nestlé kills babies for the 21st century. It was the smoking gun, the explicit public admission of the dynasty's core philosophy. If it is on earth, it can be commoditized. If the poor cannot afford it, that is not Nestlé's problem. This philosophy, that everything on earth can be commoditized, has one final physical legacy. The Nestlé empire is built on single-use plastic. Their entire business model, selling small, convenient portions of water, coffee, and food, relies on disposable packaging. The company produces 1.7 million metric tons of plastic packaging every single year. The result is a global environmental catastrophe. The global Break Free from Plastic audit, conducted annually by environmental groups, has named Nestlé, along with Coca-Cola and PepsiCo, as one of the world's top 3 plastic polluters every single year. Nestlé's plastic waste, its Kit Kat wrappers, its Nescafé sachets, its Pure Life bottles, is found choking rivers in the Philippines, littering beaches in Africa, and swirling in the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. This is the physical, non-degradable, forever legacy of their convenience model. The company's response, once again, is a classic PR greenwash. They have made massive public pledges to make 100% of our packaging recyclable or reusable by 2025. But activists like Greenpeace point out this is a deliberate deception. Recyclable is not the same as recycled. The vast majority of this packaging, particularly in the developing nations where Nestlé is most aggressively marketing these products, is not recycled. The public waste infrastructure simply does not exist. The company, critics argue, is shifting the blame for the waste crisis onto the consumer while refusing to change its fundamental profit-driven business model of selling things in single-use, throwaway plastic. From the 1970s to today, the pattern is identical. Whether it is infant formula, child slave cocoa, or public water, the Nestlé dynasty's strategy is the same. First, find a vulnerable population or a communal resource. Second, exploit it for maximum profit while ignoring the human and environmental costs. Third, when caught, deny, delay, and launch a massive public relations campaign, the WHO Code, the COCO Plan, the Water Stewardship Program to greenwash the problem. And fourth, never, ever change the core, profitable, and exploitative business model. The scandals are not exceptions. They are the empire, a dynasty of managers. The dynasty that Henri Nestlé founded in 1866 was, from its very beginning, a paradox. He was a humanitarian innovator who created a product to save infants, but he was also a dynast without a dynasty. Henri and his wife Clémentine had no children of their own. When he sold his company, his formula, and his very name in 1875 for 1 million francs, he severed the bloodline forever. This act defined the Nestlé empire. Unlike the Rockefellers, the Bechtels, or the Maxwells, the Nestlé dynasty is not one of sons and daughters, of fathers and favorite children. It is a dynasty of professional managers, a line of succession based not on blood, but on a shared, ruthless corporate culture. The family is the corporation itself, an immortal, multi-generational entity whose primary goal is not personal glory, but its own perpetual profitable survival. This corporate dynasty has faced its own share of personal tragedies, not in the form of family suicides or prison sentences, but in the public humiliation of its leaders. These men, who inherit the title of CEO, also inherit the company's century of sin. Peter Brabeck-Letmathe, the formidable CEO who led the company from 1997 to 2008, became the human face of the water privatization scandal. His personal tragedy was a 2005 interview in which he, with the classic unfiltered arrogance of a Nestlé manager, articulated the company's core philosophy. He stated that the idea of water as a fundamental human right was an extreme view. He argued, as a pure capitalist, that water was a foodstuff just like any other, and that it should have a market value. This comment, ripped from its academic context and posted on the internet, became a global firestorm. It was the modern equivalent of "let them eat cake." Brabeck was in that moment the most hated CEO on earth, the man who believed the poor did not have a right to drink. The video, which still circulates with millions of views on platforms like TikTok and Reddit, became a rallying cry for a new generation of anti-Nestlé activists. The boycott, which had once been about baby killers, was now reborn for Gen Z, focused on water vampires. The intense personal backlash forced Brabeck to spend years clarifying his remarks, but the damage was done. He had, in one moment of honesty, revealed the amoral, market-driven heart of the Nestlé machine. His successors, Paul Bulck and the current CEO Mark Schneider, have faced the same inheritance. Schneider, who took over in 2017, has spent his entire tenure in a defensive crouch, fending off the legal and moral consequences of his predecessor's actions. He is the man named personally in the U.S. federal lawsuits over child slavery in the cocoa supply chain. He is the one facing the renewed activist pressure over plastic pollution and water extraction. The company's internal disputes are not family feuds, but shareholder revolts. In the 2010s, activist investors like Third Point, led by Daniel Loeb, bought massive stakes in the company, demanding it streamline its operations, sell off legacy divisions, and focus more ruthlessly on high-margin products like Nespresso, pet care, and, ironically, Pfizer's infant nutrition wing, which Nestlé acquired for a staggering $11.9 billion in 2012. This acquisition, which critics at IB Fan and Save the Children decried as a doubling down on the aggressive marketing of formula in developing nations, was a clear signal. The company's response to 40 years of boycotts was not to shrink its most controversial division, but to invest $12 billion in expanding it. The Nestlé family response to all of this, the boycotts, the child labor, the water wars, the plastic pollution, has been a masterclass in modern corporate public relations. This is the other half of their business model. For every act of exploitation, there is an equal and opposite PR campaign. In response to the cocoa scandal, they launched the Nestlé Cocoa Plan in 2009. This 110 million franc program promised to build schools, train farmers, and monitor for child labor. In response to the water crisis, they launched a massive water stewardship program, pledging to reduce water consumption in their factories by 40%. In response to the plastics crisis, they launched the Human Element campaign and pledged billions to achieve 100% recyclable packaging. But critics, from Greenpeace to Corporate Accountability International, have labeled this entire strategy as greenwashing and corporate washing. They argue these plans are a cynical shield, a multi-billion-dollar marketing budget designed to distract from the core, unchanged problems. The Cocoa Plan, they allege, has failed. The 2020 NORC report, which found 1.56 million children still in hazardous labor, was proof. The plan monitors only a fraction of the supply chain, and it refuses to address the root cause: the poverty-level prices Nestlé pays for its cocoa. The Water Stewardship Plan, they argue, is a similar deception. It focuses on making Nestlé's factories more efficient, which is good for their bottom line. But it does nothing to address the core problem: the extraction of millions of gallons of public water from drought-stricken communities in California, Pakistan, and France. And the recycling pledge, activists say, is the most cynical of all. Recyclable is a meaningless word in a village in the Philippines that has no recycling infrastructure. The pledge, they argue, is a deliberate tactic to shift the blame for plastic waste from the producer to the consumer. This brings us to the final haunting question of the Nestlé dynasty. Is this all part of a global conspiracy? The theories are vast and compelling. The most popular, which flares up constantly on Reddit and other forums, is that Nestlé is at the center of a secret cabal to privatize and control the world's fresh water supply. Peter Brabeck's infamous "water is not a right" comment is seen as the smoking gun. His long-standing membership in the secretive Bilderberg Group is cited as proof that he is coordinating this plan with other global elites. The theory posits that Nestlé is intentionally buying up water sources and draining aquifers to create an artificial scarcity, which will, in the near future, force the world's population to buy their pure life water at monopoly prices. While this makes for a terrifying narrative, the reality, as documented by historians and financial journalists, is both simpler and more chilling. It is not a secret conspiracy. It is open source capitalism. The real soft power of Nestlé is not hidden. It is visible in its lobbying budgets. The company spends millions of dollars every year in Washington, D.C. and Brussels, lobbying to weaken nutritional labeling laws, to fight taxes on sugary drinks, and to block regulations that would restrict its marketing of infant formula. Its power is also in its capture of international health bodies. Nestlé is one of the largest corporate funders of nutritional research, health conferences, and even projects within the World Health Organization and UNICEF. Critics argue this is a blatant conflict of interest. The company that is a primary cause of global obesity and infant malnutrition is simultaneously funding the very organizations responsible for solving those problems, ensuring they remain a partner at the table, able to shape the conversation and soften any regulations that might truly hurt their profits. The final verdict on the Nestlé dynasty is not that it is a secret conspiracy, but that it is the most perfect, successful, and amoral example of 21st century global capitalism. The company's history is not defined by a single evil dynastic family. It is defined by a system, a corporate structure that has no family to feel shame, no single patriarch to hold accountable. It is a machine designed for one purpose: perpetual growth. This machine has no morality in the human sense. It sees a dying infant in 1867 as a business opportunity. It sees a starving, illiterate mother in Africa in 1977 as a new market. It sees a 10-year-old child in the Ivory Coast with a machete as a cost-saving measure. And it sees a public aquifer in a drought-stricken village as an undervalued asset. The problem, as critics like Corporate Accountability International argue, is not that Nestlé is evil in the manner of a comic book villain. The problem is that it is systematically exploitative. Its business model requires it to find the cheapest raw materials and the most vulnerable new markets. The child slavery and the water depletion are not bugs in the system. They are features. This is the true and most terrifying legacy of the Nestlé dynasty. It is a family of managers, CEOs, and shareholders who have perfected a system that profits from the very problems it claims to be solving. They sell health and wellness while being a primary driver of obesity and diabetes. They sell sustainability while being one of the world's top plastic polluters. And they built their entire 150-year-old, $105 billion empire on the foundation of a product that saved babies, only to be accused for the next 50 years of killing them. The boycott, which began in 1977, continues to this day in over 20 countries, a half-century-long testament to the deep global distrust of the Nestlé name. The battle is now being fought by a new generation on TikTok and Reddit, who share videos of Peter Brabeck and lists of Nestlé-owned brands to avoid. Henri Nestlé's logo, the mother bird, in her little nest feeding her young, has for millions become the ultimate symbol of corporate hypocrisy, a predator disguised as a nurturer.